Article 1. Here's why the stimulus check should be bigger. President Trump, who was never willing to step into negotiations for a COVID-19 stimulus package when they were ongoing or publicly share his view that the bill's $600 checks were too small, threw an inexcusable wrench into the efforts to send relief to Americans. Now that Trump has signed the bill, the Post reports, the Treasury Department is scrambling to get out the checks after Trump's stalling. In addition, the Trump administration is racing to distribute a wide array of funds, including those that aim to boost cash-strapped businesses and help unemployed workers at risk of losing their benefits. Millions, in other words, could lose a week's pay. Democrats have been complaining about the size of the bill's direct payments, which Republicans oppose until the 11th hour. If not for progressives such as independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, and both Democratic senators of Massachusetts and Oregon, who wanted $1,200 checks, there would not be any direct payments on the bill at all. On Monday, the House passed on a 275 to 134 vote to measure to increase the stimulus checks from $600 to $2,000. 44 Republicans voted for the $2,000 amount. The measure goes over to the Senate. There are legitimate criticisms that the check should not go to households making as much as $150,000. Nevertheless, there is now more justification than ever for Congress to negotiate more generous checks, and more than just one. Stephen Ratner, a former economic advisor in the Obama administration, writes, "At the end of last week alone, 4 important economic statistics came in weaker than expected and moving in the wrong direction. Consumer confidence fell to 88.6, well below the 97 that had been projected and down from the downwardly revised 92.9 in November, originally reported at 96.1, he adds. Similarly, consumer spending declined due to a big drop in auto sales, as well as in services including food and hotels. The large drop in personal income was directly attributable expiring stimulus programs. Finally, after a strong summer and fall, new home sales fell sharply. In addition, we continue to add roughly 800,000 new unemployment claims each week, the New York Times reports. More than 20 million Americans are collecting unemployment benefits, and the unemployment rate stands at 6.7%. A year ago, before the pandemic hit, the jobless rate touched 3.5%, touching a 50-year low. This portrait of a decrepit economy explains why the Federal Reserve and businesses alike have been pushing for another stimulus bill for months. A Congress-dawdled distress and hardships for millions of unemployed or food-insecure Americans dragged on. Trump's hissy fit drags out this even further. But the real outrage was the Republicans' refusal to pass anything with direct payments for months. Among other consequences of a prolonged recession and joblessness, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome H. Powell warned in October that once you're permanently laid off, it's just more difficult to get back into the workforce. In November, he was still warning, "My sense is that we will need to do more and that Congress will need to do more." The danger in trying to steer the economy through the recession was always in doing too little and not doing too much. Now is not the time to worry about spending restraint. Trump's delay has caused more distress than needed, and the response will have to be bigger if we are to prevent even greater suffering and long-term economic damage. Congress should not wait any longer to get more money into the pockets of more Americans. Dragging their heels is a recipe for economic calamity. Article 2. Trump's $2,000 stimulus checks are a big mistake. Family incomes are down much from COVID-19, and there is a risk of overheating the economy. The attack I made on Bloomberg Television on the idea of universal $2,000 checks as a COVID-19 response has lit up the Twitter sphere, so I think it worthwhile to be clear about what I am arguing. Certainly I am not opposing stimulus or favoring austerity. For years I have been making the secular stagnation case for many expansionary fiscal policy and have often remarked over the last couple of months that not passing fiscal stimulus is like not wearing a mask at a large indoor gathering, an insane risk. And both in the immediate term and on a permanent basis, I am all for strengthening the social safety net with measures such as enlarged supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits or an expanded earned income tax credit, or child tax credit. There can be no argument that the stimulus bill Congress passed should be implemented immediately, even though it is too little too late. As I have observed, it fails to support the states and localities as they try to rehire teachers and healthcare workers. It does too little to accelerate the availability of the testing necessary to put COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. And its 1 month extension of the eviction moratorium and 11-week extension of unemployment insurance are clearly far too short term. The issue is whether spending about $600 billion on a one-time tax credit would be worth $8,000 to a family of four and reach more than 85% of taxpayers makes good economic sense. Victims of COVID-19 disruption can and should receive generous targeted support, as should the poor. The question in assessing universal tax rebates is, what about the vast majorities of families who are still working and whose incomes have not declined and whose pension or Social Security benefits have not been affected by COVID-19? For this group, the pandemic has reduced the ability to spend more than the ability to earn. The data are striking. Total employee compensation is now running at about $30 billion per month, behind the pre-COVID baseline. Measures in the congressional stimulus bill to strengthen the unemployment insurance and to support businesses will add about $150 billion a month to household income in order to replace all this loss. The question is whether there is a rationale for further tax debate of more than $200 billion a month over the next quarter. This would represent additional support equal to an additional 7 times the loss of household wage and salary income over the next quarter. Some argue that while $2,000 checks may not be optimal support for the post-COVID economy, taking stimulus from $600 to $2,000 is better than nothing. They need to ask themselves whether they would favor $5,000 or $10,000 or more. There must be a limiting principle. One obvious candidate is not overdoing overinsurance. Bringing working families' income up to benchmark levels is natural. Perhaps bringing them somewhat above benchmark levels makes sense. But further adding to earnings when losses are being replaced 7 times over seems hard to justify, especially at a time when pent-up savings total $1.6 trillion and is rising. If writing universal checks is a good idea, why not do it after household incomes have reverted back to normal? This point is illustrated by the figure below. It shows that because of the legislation passed in 2020, total household income, which takes no account of the stock market, has exceeded normal levels relative to the economy's potential, more or less since the pandemic began. Without new stimulus, things would have normalized in 2021. But the existing stimulus bill is sufficient to elevate household income relative to the economy's potential to abnormally high levels, unheard of during an economic downturn. With President Trump's add-on, we are now in completely uncharted territory. The household income is more than 15% above the normal level relative to economic potential. We frankly have no confident basis for judging how much and how fast this excess and the pre-existing backlog of savings from the CARES Act will be spent. There is the possibility of some overheating, particularly if the economy's potential supply remains constrained by COVID protection measures. Notice in 2021 here, Q1, which is January, February, March, April, the first 4 months. Sorry, January, February, March, the first 3 months, we see that spike. As my recent paper with Jason Furman argues, I am all for a far more expansive approach to fiscal policy, but that does not mean indiscriminate support for universal giveaways at a time when household income losses are being fully replaced and checking account balances, at least as of October, were above pre-COVID levels. There's no good economic argument for $2,000 checks, a policy that was not even on the table until the president's random pronouncement last week. The Democrats seizing this opportunity to pit the president and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell against each other is fair and good politics. But if it leads to actual implementation, it is bad economics. Trump should instead immediately sign the bipartisan relief package that took months to negotiate and avoid a cutoff of unemployment insurance that will plunge millions of the most vulnerable Americans into poverty.